Hi, welcome back to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Chapter 7, Charlie's Birthday. Happy birthday! Cried the four old grandparents as Charlie came into their room early the next morning. Charlie smiled nervously and sat down on the edge of the bed. He was holding his present, his only present, very carefully in his two hands. Wonka's Wimple scrumptiously dumptious fudge, fudge mellow delight. It was on the wrapper. The four old people, two at either end of the bed, popped themselves up on their pillows and stared with anxious eyes at the candy bar in Charlie's hands. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came in and stood at the foot of the bed watching Charlie. The room became silent. Everybody was waiting now for Charlie to start opening his present. Charlie looked down at the candy bar. He ran his fingers slowly back and forth along the length of it, stroking it lovingly, and the shiny paper wrapper made little sharp, crackly noises in the quiet room. I'm just going to say, as a writer, this is a great way to write descriptive paragraphs into your narratives. Notice the descriptions that he uses and describes in detail so you can picture every part. Then Mrs. Bucket said gently, "You mustn't be too disappointed, my darling. If you don't find what you're looking for underneath that wrapper, you really can't expect to be as lucky as all that." "She's quite right," Mr. Bucket said. Charlie didn't say anything. "After all," Grandma Josephine said, "in the whole wide world there are only 3 tickets left to be found." "The thing to remember," Grandma Georgina said, "it's that whatever happens, you'll still have the bar of candy. Wonka's Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mellow Delight," cried Grandpa George. "It's the best of them all. You'll just love it." "Yes," Charlie whispered, "I know." "Just forget about all those golden tickets. Enjoy the candy," Grandpa Joe said. Why don't you do that?" They all knew it was ridiculous to expect this one poor little candy bar to have a magic ticket inside it, and they were trying as gently and as kindly as they could to prepare Charlie for the disappointment. But then there was one other thing that the grown-ups also knew, and it was this: that however small the chance might be of striking lucky, the chance was there. The chance had to be there. This particular candy bar had as much chance as any other having a golden ticket. And that was why all the grandparents and parents in the room were actually just as tense and excited as Charlie was, although they were pretending to be very calm. "You'd better go ahead and open it up, or you'll be late for school," Grandpa Joe said. "You might as well just get it over with," Grandpa George said. "Open it, my dear," Grandma Georgina said. "Please open it. You're making me jumpy." Very slowly, Charlie's fingers began to tear open one small corner of the wrapping paper. The old people in the bed all leaned forward, cranking their scraggy necks. Then, suddenly, as though he couldn't bear the suspense any longer, Charlie just tore the wrapper right down the middle and onto his lap. There fell a light brown, creamy-colored chocolate candy bar. There was no sign of a golden ticket anywhere. "Well, that's that," said Grandpa Joe brightly. "It's just what we expected." Charlie looked up. 4 kind old faces were watching him intently from the bed. He smiled at them, a small, sad smile, and then he shrugged his shoulders and picked up the candy bar and held it out to his mother and said, "Here, Mother, have a bit. We'll share it. I want everybody to taste it." "Certainly not," his mother said, and the others all cried, "No, no, we wouldn't dream of it. It's all yours." "Please," begged Charlie, turning around and offering it to Grandpa Joe. But neither he nor anyone else would take even a tiny bite. "It's time to go to school, my darling," Miss Bucket said, putting an arm around Charlie's skinny shoulders. "Come on, you'll be late. Chapter 8. 2 more golden tickets found. That evening, Mr. Bucket's newspaper announced the finding of not only the third golden ticket, but the fourth one as well. 2 golden tickets found today, screamed the headlines. Only one more left. "All right," said Grandpa Joe when the whole family was gathered in the old people's room after supper. "Let's hear who found them." "The third ticket," read Mr. Bucket, holding the newspaper up close to his face because his eyes were bad and he couldn't afford glasses. "The third ticket was found by a Miss Violet Beauregard." There was great excitement in the Beauregard household when our reporter arrived to interview the lucky young lady. Cameras were clicking and flashbulbs were flashing, and people were pushing and jostling and trying to get a bit closer to the famous girl. And the famous girl was standing on a chair in the living room, waving the golden ticket madly at an arm's length, as though she was flagging a taxi. She was talking very fast and very loudly to everyone, but it was not easy to hear all that she had to say because she was chewing so ferociously upon a piece of gum at the same time. "I'm a gum chewer normally," she shouted, "but when I heard about these tickets thing of Mr. Wonka's, I laid off the gum and switched to candy bars in the hope of striking lucky. Now, of course, I'm right back on the gum. I just adore gum. I just can't do without it. I munch it all day long except for a few minutes at mealtime when I take it off, stick it behind my ear for safekeeping. To tell you the honest truth, I simply wouldn't feel comfortable if I didn't have a little wedge of gum to chew on every moment of the day. I really wouldn't. My mother says it's not ladylike and it looks ugly to see a girl's jaws going up and down like mine do all the time, but I don't agree. And who's she to criticize anyway? Because if you ask me, I'd say that her jaws are always up and down almost as much as mine, as just from yelling at me every minute of the day." "Now, Violet," Mrs. Beauregard said from a far corner of the room where she was standing on the piano to avoid being trampled by the mob. "All right, Mother, keep your hair on," Miss Beauregard shouted. "And now," she went on, turning to the reporters again, "it may interest you to know that this piece of gum I'm chewing right here at this moment is one I've been working on for 3 months solid. That's a record, that is. It's beaten the record held by my very best friend, Miss Cornelia Prince-Messel, and she was mad. It's my most treasured possession now, this piece of gum is. At nights, I just stick it on the end of my bedpost, and it's as good as ever in the mornings. A bit hard at first, maybe, but it softens up again after I've given it a few good chews. Before I started chewing for the world record, I used to change my piece of gum once a day. I used to do it in our elevator on the way home from school. Why the elevator? Well, because I like sticking the gooey piece that I've just finished with onto one of the elevator buttons. Then the next person who came along and pressed the button got my old gum and the end of his or her finger. And what a racket they kicked up, some of them. You get the best results with women who have expensive gloves on. Oh, yes, I'm thrilled to be going to Mr. Wonka's factory, and I understand that afterwards he's going to give me enough gun to last me for the rest of my whole life. Whoopee, hooray! Beastly girl, said Grandma Josephine. Despicable, said Grandma Georgina. She'll come to a sticky end one day, chewing all that gum. You see if she doesn't. And who's got the fourth ticket? Daddy, Charlie asked. Now let me see, said Mr. Bucket, peering at the newspaper again. Ah, yes, here we are. The fourth golden ticket, he read, was found by a boy called Mike TV. Another bad lot, I'll be bound, muttered Grandma Josephine. Don't interrupt, Grandma, said Mrs. Bucket. The TV household, said Mr. Bucket, going on with his reading, was crammed like all the others with excited visitors when our reporter arrived. But young Mike TV, the lucky winner, seemed extremely annoyed by the whole business. Can you see, fools? See, I'm watching television, he said angrily. I wish you wouldn't interrupt. The 9-year-old boy was seated before an enormous television set with his eyes glued to the screen, and he was watching a film in which a bunch of gangsters was shooting up another bunch of gangsters with machine guns. Mike TV himself had no less 18 toy pistols of various sizes hanging from his belts around his body, and every now and then he would leap up into the air and fire off a dozen rounds from one or another of these weapons. Quiet, he shouted when someone tried to ask him a question. Didn't I tell you not to interrupt? The show's an absolutely whiz-banger. It's terrific. I watch it every day. I watch all of them every day, even the crummy ones where there's no shooting. I like the cowboy gangsters best. They're terrific. They're gangsters, especially when they start pumping each other full of lead or flashing their old stilettos or giving each other the 1, 2, 3 with their knuckle dusters. Oh boy, what wouldn't I give to be doing that myself? It's the life, I tell you. It's terrific. That's quite enough, snapped Grandpa Josephine. I can't bear to listen to it. Nor me, said Grandma Georgina. Do all the children behave like this nowadays? Like these brats we've been hearing about? Of course not, said Mr. Bucket, smiling at the old lady in the bed. Some do, of course. In fact, quite a lot of them do, but not all. And now there's only one ticket left, said Grandpa George. Quite so, sniffed Grandma Georgina. And as sure as I'll be having cabbage stew for supper tomorrow, that ticket will go to some nasty little beast who doesn't deserve it. Chapter 9. Grandpa Joe Takes a Gamble. The next day, when Charlie came home from school and went in to see his grandparents, he found that only Grandpa Joe was awake. The other three were all snoring loudly. Shh, whispered Grandpa Joe, and he beckoned Charlie to come closer. Charlie tiptoed over and stood beside the bed. The old man gave Charlie a sly grin, and then he started rummaging under his pillow with one hand, and when the hand came out, there was a ancient leather purse clutched to his fingers under cover of the bedclothes. The only man opened the purse and tipped it upside down. The old man. Out fell a single silver 10-cent piece. It's my secret hoard, he whispered. The others don't know I've got it. And now you and I are going to have one more fling at finding that last ticket. How about it, eh? But you'll have to help me. Are you sure you want to spend your money on that, Grandpa? Charlie whispered. Of course I'm sure, spluttered the old man excitedly. Don't just stand there arguing. I'm just as crazy as you are to find that ticket. Here, take the money and run down the street to the nearest store and buy the first Wonka candy bar you see and bring it straight back to me, and we'll open it together." Charlie took the little silver coin, slipped it quickly out of the room. In 5 minutes he was back. "Have you got it?" whispered Grandpa Joe, his eyes shining with excitement. Charlie nodded and held out the bar. "Wonka's Nutty Crunch Surprise," it said on the wrapper. "Good," the old man whispered, sitting up on the bed, rubbing his hands. "Now, come over here and sit close to me, and we'll open it together. Are you ready?" "Yes," Charlie said, "I'm ready." "All right, you tear off the first bit." "No," Charlie said, "you paid for it. You do it." The old man's fingers were trembling most terribly as they fumbled with the candy bar. We don't have a hope, really," he whispered, giggling a bit. "You do know we don't have a hope, don't you?" "Yes," Charlie said, "I know that." They looked at each other and they both stared, giggling nervously. "Mind you," said Grandpa Joe, "there is that tiny chance that it might be the one. Don't you agree?" "Yes," Charlie said. "Of course. Why don't you open it, Grandma?" "All in good time, my boy, all in good time." "Which end do you think I ought to open first?" "That corner, the one furthest from you. Just tear it off a tiny bit, but not quite enough for us to see anything." "Like that?" said the old man. "Yes. Now a little bit more." "You finish it," said Grandpa Joe. "I'm too nervous." "No, Grandpa, you must do it yourself." "Very well, then. Here it goes." He tore off the wrapper. They both stared at it. What lay underneath? It was a bar of candy, nothing more. All at once they both saw the funny side of the whole thing, and they burst into peals of laughter. "What the heck's going on?" cried Grandpa Josephine, waking up suddenly. "Nothing," said Grandpa Joe. "You just go back to sleep." Chapter 10. The family begins to starve. During the next 2 weeks, the weather turned very cold. First came the snow. It began very suddenly one morning, just as Charlie Bucket was getting dressed for school. Standing by the window, he saw the huge flakes drifting slowly down of an icy sky that was the color of steel. By evening, it lay 4 feet deep around the tiny house, and Mr. Bucket had to dig a path from the front door to the road. After the snow, there came a freezing gale that blew 4 days and days without stopping. And oh, how bitter cold it was. Everything that Charlie touched seemed to be made of ice. And each time he stepped outside the door, the wind was like a knife on his cheek. Notice the simile, like a knife on his cheek. Inside the house, little jets of freezing air came rushing in through the sides of the windows and under the doors, and there was no place to go to escape them. The 4 old ones lay silent and huddled in their bed, trying to keep the cold out of their bones. The excitement over the golden tickets had long since been forgotten. Nobody in the family gave a thought now to anything except the 2 vital problems of trying to keep warm and trying to get enough to eat. There is something about very cold weather that gives one an enormous appetite. Most of us find ourselves beginning to crave rich, steaming stews and hot apple pies and all kinds of delicious, warming dishes. And because we're all a great deal luckier than we realize, we usually got what we want or near enough. But Charlie Bucket never got what he wanted because the family couldn't afford it. And as the cold weather went on, he began, ravishly and desperately hungry. Both bars of candy, the birthday one and the one Grandpa Joe had bought, had long since been nibbled away, and all he got now were those thin, cabbagey meals 3 times a day. Then, all at once, the meals became even thinner. The reason for this was that the toothpaste factory, the place where Mr. Bucket worked, suddenly went bust and had to close down. Quickly, Mr. Bucket tried to get another job, but he had no luck. In the end, the only way in which he managed to earn a few pennies was to be shoveling snow in the streets. But it wasn't enough to buy even a quarter of the food that 7 people needed. The situation became desperate. Breakfast was a single slice of bread for each person now, and lunch was maybe half a boiled potato. Slowly but surely, everyone in the house began to starve, and every day little Charlie Bucket, trudging through the snow on his way to school, would have to pass Willy Wonka's giant chocolate factory, and every day as he came near it, he would lift his small pointed nose up in the air and sniff the wonderful sweet smell of melting chocolate. Sometimes he would stand motionless outside the gates for several minutes on end, taking deep, shallowing breaths as though he was trying to eat the smell itself. "That child," said Grandpa Joe, poking his head up from under the blanket, "one icy morning, that child has," showing the gates of Charlie and the chocolate factory. "One icy morning, that child has got to have more food. It doesn't matter about us. We're too old to bother with. But a growing boy, he can't go on like this. He's beginning to look like a skeleton." "What can we do? What can one do?" murmured Grandma Josephine miserably. "He refuses to take any of ours. I hear his mother tried to slip her own piece of bread onto his plate at breakfast this morning, but he wouldn't touch it. He made her take it back." "He's a fine little fellow," said Grandpa George. "He deserves better than this." The cruel weather went on, and every day Charlie Bucket grew thinner and thinner. His face became frighteningly white and pinched. The skin was drawn so tightly over the cheeks that you could see the shapes of the bones underneath. It seemed doubtful whether he could go on much longer like this without becoming dangerously ill. And now, very calmly, with the curious wisdom that seems to come so often to small children in times of hardship, he began to make little changes here and there in some of his things that he did, as to save his strength. In the mornings he left the house 10 minutes earlier, and he would walk slowly to school without even having to run. He sat quietly in the classroom during recess, resting himself, while the others rushed outdoors and threw snowballs and wrestled in the snow. Everything he did now, he did slowly and carefully to prevent exhaustion. The one afternoon, walking back home with the city wind in his face, and incidentally feeling hungrier than he had ever felt before, his eye was caught suddenly by a piece of paper that was lying in the gutter. In the snow, the paper was of greenish color, and there was something vaguely familiar about it. Charlie stepped off the curb and bent over to examine it. Part of it was buried under the snow, but he saw it at once, and there it was. It was a dollar bill. Quickly he looked around him. Had somebody dropped it? No, that was impossible, because the way part of it was buried. Several people went hurrying past him on the sidewalk, their chins sunk deep in the collars of their coats, their feet crunching in the snow. None of them was searching for any money. None of them was taking the slightest notice of the small boy crouching in the gutter. Then there it was. Then it was in his, then it was his, this dollar. Could he have it? Carefully, Charlie pulled it from under the snow. It was as damp and dirty, but otherwise perfect, a whole dollar. He held it tightly between his shivering fingers, gazing down at it. It meant one thing to him. At that moment, only one thing. It meant food. Automatically, Charlie turned and began moving toward the nearest shop. It was only 10 paces away. It was a newspaper and stationery store, the kind that sells almost everything, including candy and cigars. And what would he do? He whispered quickly to himself. Would he buy one luscious bar of candy and eat it all up, every bit of it, right there, right then and there, and the rest of the money he would take straight back home to give to his mother? So tune in next time to Chapter 11, The Miracle.